have a lot of weird encounters outside my office on my smoke breaks, but I think this one takes the cake, even with how anticlimactic it was. Today I was sitting on the wall outside my building smoking and messing around on my phone. I had probably been sitting there for about 2 minutes without looking up when I finally do and notice a guy on the corner, about 20 feet away, staring intently at me. He's hunched over facing me in the classic zombie pose, wearing a large coat, a surgical mask, and gloves. I didn't know how long he'd been standing there, but it was daytime, and the area is relatively populated, so despite being the only people on the street, I wasn't too worried. I went back to looking at my phone, but kept discreetly glancing in his direction to see if he was still there. He didn't move or stop looking at me for probably another minute and a half, just sunken shoulders with his unblinking eyes pointed directly at me over his mask. Finally, I notice an older man walking towards us, and my cigarette is almost finished, so I assume the worst comes to worse. This guy will be near if anything happens. I glance back at my phone and hear what I assume are the older man's footsteps vastly approaching. Before I have a chance to look up, the surgical zombie is sitting within an inch of me on the wall. I'm a polite girl, so I give him a vague smile while my inner self and personal space are screaming at me to get up and leave. He asks me for a cigarette, so I give him one, and he just continues to sit there with it unlit. I can't fight my manners, so I ask him if he needs a light. He gives me a gloved double thumbs up and stares at me. I ask him if that meant he had one, to which he responds with another double thumbs up. I assume that was him saying he did, so I turn back to my phone, planning on taking one more drag before getting up to leave. He then says, "Yes, I need one," so I give him my lighter. He hands it back and I put my smoke out and stand up. He then begins laughing, like full belly laughing. I didn't really know how to respond, so I tell him to have a nice day and I walk into my building. To be honest, I've really never had a fear of people, and I can't say this is the first time I've had someone done something like this, but the mask and gloves really added to the absurdity of the whole situation. It's Friday night at around 8:45 p.m. The little one's in bed, and I'm chilling with some friends online gaming. There's a loud bang, and I'm instantly freaking out due to having my home, my safe place, invaded by some creeper twice in the past 3 months. I turn the volume on my computer down, trying my best to come up with excuses. Oh, it was the neighbors doing something. Who in their right minds would try to break into my house when they can see that I'm awake? Front outdoor light on, lounge light on. It's quiet for a while, so I return to playing the game and talking to my friends. That's when I hear rustling. I think it's coming from the game, despite the volume being super low, but to be safe, I turn the sound of the computer off completely. The rustling's still there. At this point, I think it might be that annoying pest possum. The banging could have been it jumping onto the garage roof, and now it was shuffling around outside the leaves searching for some food. As I said earlier, who would try to trespass when they could clearly see someone was home? If they did trespass, why would they be doing so loudly? I want to say it put me at ease, but it didn't. Fast forward half an hour and the noises have stopped, and my cat's begging me to be let outside. Little bastard. I hate opening doors, curtains, or windows at night. Paranoia at its finest. But tonight I had a reason to be paranoid at least. I kept the chain lock on the door and let the little fat fuzzball squeeze out, and had a bit of a peek through the crack, seeing if anything was amiss on my front lawn. Nothing out of the ordinary, so I lock the door and head back to the lounge. 5 minutes later, someone tries the door handle. Finding it locked, I hear a laugh and they start scratching on the glass as I frantically grab my phone and call the police. Whoever it was left by the time they answered the phone, and police couldn't find evidence that anyone had been on my property. They did a sweep of the neighborhood, but couldn't find anyone on the streets either. Whoever you are, I'd say let's not meet, but I'm pretty sure you're the same person who came the other 2 times, and I'm fairly certain that that person is my ex. So Mr. X, if it is you, smile for the cameras next time you come around. They just arrived in my mailbox today. This past weekend, my soon-to-be wife Alexia and I had just settled down for a night of movies, pizza, and cuddling. We live in a residential area right outside of town. Our home's situated right across the street from a Presbyterian church, with a large cemetery directly behind it. Most of our neighbors don't own pets, but there's one in particular across the street and downwards a bit who owns perhaps the loudest, most annoying dog to ever exist. Quite a nuisance on a night like tonight, but luckily it was quiet the entire evening. It's around 10:15 p.m. and we're lying down watching a film in our living room when the loudest dog on earth begins to go off. Unfortunately, there's nothing much we can do, except maybe confront our neighbor or file a noise complaint, but who wants to be the neighbor that does that? After about 5 minutes, I get up off the couch and decide to walk over to our neighbor's home and say something about the dog. As I headed outside and made it to their driveway, unfortunately, I noticed that the neighbor wasn't home. Their only car was gone. I decided anyway to walk up to the door and ring the bell. After a minute of no answering, I gave up and headed back towards home. I noticed that Alexia had stepped outside and was looking on towards the direction of the barking. I told her that no one was home and that we should either ignore it or file a complaint. No one should have to deal with a loud dog at night, especially if you're trying to unwind after a long day of work. Alexia and I head back inside for a bit, and finally, after about 10 minutes, the dog ceases to bark. Alexia and I exhaled and laughed a bit before continuing our film, but of course, not long after that, the dog starts up again. This time it sounded vicious. I got up, went outside and approached our neighbor's fenced-off backyard and saw the dog, who must have heard or saw me coming. It stopped barking, walked up to me and began to pant in the cute way dogs do. I chuckled and said the dog's name, to which he looked at me and sat down. Such a good animal, even if he's so loud. I then heard something that sounded like somebody walking through leaves coming from behind me and to the right. I turned around to see somebody looking at me from behind a gravestone in the cemetery. The dog must have heard this all as well, as it sprung up and began to bark in the direction of the gravestone. I looked on as the person continued staring in my direction as the dog continued to bark. I looked towards my house where I saw Alexia standing near her car, looking at me with a confused look on her face. I looked in horror as I saw the person reveal himself from behind the gravestone. His forehead and cheek were stained with red blood, dripping down off his chin. In his hand was some sort of dagger. The dog began to go ballistic as the person took a few steps in our directions before stopping. I turned to the dog and then back at my home. Alexia, who was still outside, yelled out to me what was wrong. I told her to call the police. She said, "Why, the dog?" To which I replied, "He's fucking armed." Probably confused, Alexia went inside to grab her phone as I continued to watch on. As the person now began to back off, the dog now going berserk. It was going to take a bit of time for someone to reach our home, so I readied myself to go into self-defense mode. As I watched the man finally turn around and walk away towards the back of the cemetery and towards the woods. When the police finally arrived, the person was long gone, and I was stuck there explaining to a couple of skeptical officers about my encounter. They didn't seem to take me that seriously, but still investigated the area as I explained to Alexi about the person I saw. When the police left after finding no trace of anyone, Alexi and I didn't feel much better. We locked our doors and windows, and I decided to call our neighbors to fill them in on everything before heading back to continue our movie night in spectacular fashion with The Exorcist. I was 17 at the time and just gotten my first job. I lived in rural Western Virginia in a small mountain community. My mom's friend owned a camping resort not far from my house that had a general store, and she said she'd pay me to help out in the store during the busy months in summer. It was a pretty easy job, and I met a lot of out-of-towners, which was nice because our community could get so isolated. Most of us lived pretty far away from each other. One day, a big burly mountain man type came into the store. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, probably 6'5" and about 280 pounds. He looked dirty, like he worked outside a lot. His clothes were sort of tattered, and he had a long beard. He bought some basic items, one of which was our homemade bars of soap. When he came to the register, he looked me up and down carefully. He didn't talk for a minute, just stared. His people skills clearly needed work. "Did you make this soap?" he asked gruffly. "Possibly," I said. "I help out with that sometimes." "You make a lot of your own stuff?" "Toiletries and things like that, yeah. I like that," he said, nodding to himself. I honestly did not know how to respond. I quickly rang up his items, and he paid with crumpled money. Right before he left, he asked, "You cook too?" "Sometimes," I replied. "Bet the boys round here are itching to marry you," he said as he smiled to himself. I said nothing. I was puzzled as to what I said that stood out as wife material. I told Krista, who was my boss, about the bizarre encounter, and she laughed it off. So did my family and friends. But then, Mountain Man started turning up more often. We chatted a little bit here and there, and I found out he had a cabin in the woods he claimed he built with his bare hands. He said he hunted and lived off the land, other than the things he bought at this store. Over time, our chatter escalated, with him making comments about how nice it would be to have a woman like me around who could make those things and cook his kills. One time, he even said I had the burthen hips that men lust after. He then started inviting me to fish with him, hunt with him, see his place, and I always politely declined, but he became more and more insistent, and I told Krista about how uncomfortable he was starting to make me feel. The intensity with which he said those things really scared me. She said that when he came in, go get her and she would ring him up. Thanks to her, I started speaking to him less, and I thought I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. But one night, I was closing up and it was late, around 10 p.m. Krista had left about an hour before, and I was leaving by myself. The only two cars in front of the store were an old blue pickup and mine. I was immediately alarmed because I knew Mountain Man drove a blue pickup, but I didn't see him in the lot, just his car. So I walked quickly to my car and checked the back seat before I started it up. But then when I first turned the key in the ignition, I got nothing but sputters. I tried several more times and got scared quickly. Of all nights, why is this happening tonight? I remember asking myself angrily. Just as I was reaching for my phone to call for help, there was a loud pounding on the driver's side window. I'm shocked that I didn't pee myself. I didn't even want to look because I knew it was him. But I did, and my suspicions were confirmed. He smiled a big grin at me, showing me exactly which teeth were missing. "Need some help?" he said loudly through the window. I shook my head furiously. "My dad is on his way," I said, hoping to scare him off. I hadn't spoke to my dad in years. Mountain Man laughed. "No, he's not. Open the door." The hairs on my neck stood up straight. How did he know I was bluffing? "No," I said firmly. "Leave me alone." Suddenly he looked angry. He pulled the handle, but I had locked all the doors when I first got inside. He kept furiously pulling the handle and started pounding on the window. "Leave now or I'm calling the police," I screamed at him. He clearly wasn't getting the message, so I pulled my phone out and dialed 911. I must have sounded hysterical to the dispatcher, and I knew she could hear him pounding. She said she would have officers out ASAP, but out here, that could take a while. "The cops are on their way. Leave now," I screamed at Mountain Man, who didn't seem to let it detour him. But after a few more minutes of pounding, he suddenly stopped and walked back to his truck. I watched him go, hopeful he would leave me alone. But then he started walking back towards me with a huge crowbar in his hand. "No!" I screamed at him. "Get away from me!" He started swinging at the driver's side window with the crowbar. I ducked down into the passenger seat on the floor and covered the back of my neck like they teach you in tornado drills. I heard the sickening crack of the window, but not for long. Suddenly, I heard male voices shouting, telling Mountain Man to get away from the car. I sat up and two men approached, one with a shotgun pointed at Mountain Man. I recognized them as a couple of guests staying at the resort for a camping trip. I breathed a sigh of relief and got out of the car, telling them that the police were on their way. I thanked them profusely as we waited for the police, and surprisingly Mountain Man didn't make any moves to get away, but the cops came quickly after that, so he didn't have much of a chance. They took him away and I gave them my statement. I was pretty shaken up for a while afterwards. A few weeks later, I finally got the scoop on the man. Apparently, he had a history of mental illness. He had been in and out of state institutions. He really had been living in an old cabin in the woods where he wasn't taking his meds. They found a journal that Mountain Man kept. Apparently, in it he said he was lonely and wanted a wife. He mentioned me by name, and Luke said there was a lot of lewd things in there about me that he wanted to share, but tried to put it simply by saying that Mountain Man had a detailed plan to abduct me, starting with sabotaging my car engine to get me into a vulnerable position. When Luke said that, I nearly burst into tears, thinking about how horribly that night could have gone if those two men hadn't come along. I was 19, staying late at the college darkroom to develop some film for my photography class. The photography building was a dark, rickety hulk near some lonely railroad tracks in a little traveled part of campus. I finished developing my film close to midnight and headed out, nervous as always to be alone at night in this deserted part of town. It was dark. Several of the streetlights around the parking lot were out, and the few that remained were phoning it in, putting out a weak, flickery light that did nothing to reassure me as I headed to my car. I heard him before I saw him, a scrape of feet on asphalt. He said, "Hey, can you do me a favor?" I started and dropped my keys, and he mumbled an apology for scaring me. I noticed he was wearing a jogging suit and limping. "What do you need?" I said. He hobbled a step or two toward me. "I think I sprained my ankle. Could you take me to the ER?" The university hospital was a short distance down the road. I hesitated. The guy looked perfectly pleasant, and he did seem to be in pain, but I'd recently finished a book about serial killer Ted Bundy, who lured some of his victims by pretending to have a broken arm and asking them for help carrying his books to his car. When they leaned over to put his stuff in the passenger seat of his VW Bug, he knocked them unconscious with a crowbar and stuffed them inside. This scene played across my mind as I looked at the man. It also occurred to me to wonder why the hell anyone would want to jog in this creepy part of town. I'm sorry, I can't do that, but I could call somebody for you. There's a phone in the photography building there. There's nobody to call. I just moved here. I don't really know anybody. Can't you just drive me? It's just right down Limestone Avenue. He leaned against a car and winced as he reached down to rub at his ankle. I'll call you an ambulance, I offered. No, I can't afford that. I don't have health insurance. Can you just drive me? I'll pay you $20. There was something in the way he said this last bit, something wrong. Like that exercise in my acting class where you had to recite "Mary Had a Little Lamb" as though we were delivering a tragic monologue or a furious rant. There was a tone rising up that didn't quite match the words he was saying. A raw urgency that reached down inside me and hit the panic button hard. There was a moment of silence between us. I can't help you, I said. I'm leaving. I gripped my keys, slipping them between my fingers the way my mom had taught me, so I could use them as a weapon if he came at me. I kept my eyes on him as I speed walked the last few feet to my car. He watched me drive away, still leaning against that car, a flat expression on his face. Away from the dark parking lot, driving through campus with my music turned up, the fear faded. I started to feel a little guilty for leaving the guy there, although I knew I'd done what my mom and dad would have wanted me to do. I was about to turn into my dorm parking lot when I realized I needed to pick up some stuff for breakfast the next morning, so I turned around and headed back in the direction I'd come. About a minute down the road, my stomach clenched. There was a guy in the jogging suit running along the sidewalk. His ankle was perfectly fine. Later that summer, 2 students at my college were attacked by those same railroad tracks. The girl survived, but her boyfriend did not. The man who attacked them was a serial killer dubbed the Railroad Killer by police. He murdered dozens of people across several states, most of them near railroad tracks. I didn't see his mugshot on TV until years later, but the picture broke me out in the same icy sweat I felt when I saw that guy running down the street. I can't be 100% positive, but my gut tells me I escaped a serial killer that night. To give some context, I'm a 20-year-old female and live in a city that is mostly safe, so stuff like this doesn't usually happen, and that is why I could never have imagined what happened next. I live in an apartment complex in front of which is a bar. From the bar there is a main street going down, and at the end of it there's an orange house with some golden lion statues on the fence. Next to the orange house is a back street connected to the main one, and in front of the house, on the opposite sidewalk, there's a tree with a bench underneath. Now, I always enjoy going out when it's dark outside. Not too dark and late, usually between 10 and 11 p.m., because it's very quiet and it relaxes me. So, I exit the apartment complex. I'm going to smoke a cigarette on the bench under the tree, like I do almost every evening. Upon my arrival, I see a car parked slightly down from the orange house, and a man sitting in the front seat. He was talking on the phone, looking kinda nervous, occasionally looking in my direction. Okay, no red flags for now. I continued smoking my cigarette, and after a few minutes the man exits the car. He gave me a very odd look, went to open the passenger door, and as he was searching for something, mind you, he looked back at me pretty often while searching, I could hear some metallic sounds like he was going through a toolbox. I became more aware of the situation, and I got up, even if I didn't finish my cigarette, and started heading back to the complex. I was walking fast enough to put some distance between me and the man, but not too fast to let him know that I was scared and onto him. In the distance, I could hear him talking on the phone again, but this time he seemed very angry, so I picked up the pace. As I looked back at him to see if he was following me, I saw him next to his car holding something in his hand, which looked like a hammer, but I couldn't make it very clearly because I only had a short glance. I was almost at the apartment complex when I heard fast thumping, indicating that now he was running after me. I noped the hell out of there and ran into the apartment complex, making sure the door was locked. I went to the first floor and hid there to see if he followed me, and I waited. After 5 minutes or so, I see his car coming in front of the complex. He stopped the car, looked around and into the complex for a few minutes, still talking on the phone, very angry. After said few minutes, one of my neighbors was heading down the stairs and asked me what I was doing there, since my apartment was on the 3rd floor. I told him that the man in the car outside was following me, and he went to confront him, but as he was exiting the building, the man in the car saw him and sped up. I never saw the man or that car again, and I hope I never do. So creepy man with a hammer, let's not meet again. Thank you guys for watching and listening. Please be sure to leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe for future content. Email your true scary stories to thesinfulsavant@gmail.com. I will leave a link to my email in the description box below as well. Until we meet again, stay sinful.